Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Erin, welcome to the podcast.
So nice to be here with you, Carey.
Yeah, I read your book and it was just fascinating. And I Googled you and found you, and you graciously agreed to come on the show, which I so appreciate. So you've had a whole career studying culture mapping, and you did a lot of like national cultures, which is really cool, right? Like if you're going to Japan, how does that culture behave? If you're going to Canada, you even got one on Canada, which is interesting. I was tempted to buy it just to see how weird we are. But anyway, but then you wrote a book with Reed Hasting, the founder of Netflix, on Netflix's culture. So let's start here. How did you and Reed meet?
Yeah, so actually that's quite an interesting story. So my first book, as you said, is The Culture Map. It's all about national cultural differences. And that book came out in 2014. And when it came out, it was kind of like a slow starter. I mean, eventually people started reading it, but not right at the beginning. So because of that, perhaps I was quite surprised when one morning I woke up and I picked up my phone. I know you're not supposed to do that, but I picked up my phone. I checked my email first thing. And I remember there was this email in my inbox, and the subject line said Peace Corps. And when I read it, it said, "Hi, Erin. I've just read your book. I was in the Peace Corps like you were, near where you were. I'm trying to have everyone read the book in my organization. My name is Reed, and I'm the CEO of Netflix." And I remember I sat up really straight when I got to the end of the email. So in any case, that's how I met Reed, this kind of like cold email out of nowhere. And I started working with Netflix on their international expansion. And then I was just so interested in this just crazy and provocatively strange corporate culture that they had at Netflix that I guess I just kept at him until he agreed to work on a book with me on it.
That's fantastic. What struck you as weird when you first started working with Netflix?
Yeah, well, so like many of your listeners, I first came across the Netflix culture even before Reed had contacted me when I read the Netflix culture deck, which is this set of slides that's been read like 20 million times. And if you've seen that, there are some things in it that I found quite startling. So for example, one of the slides says, "At Netflix, adequate performance gets a generous severance." And when I saw that slide, it really struck me because we'd been spending so much time at INSEAD, at the business school that I teach at. We'd been spending so much time researching and talking about the idea of psychological safety. And here was an organization that wasn't talking about that. Instead, they were saying, if your employees don't perform at the highest level, go ahead and kick them out. Right? And there were other things in there, like there was a slide that said, at Netflix, our vacation policy is take some, right? And something about their expense policy is act in Netflix's best interest. And I thought those ideas were interesting, but I just couldn't figure out how a real company could actually operate under those guidelines. So those are some of the strange and provocative things that I came across, and I guess many of your listeners may have heard about also.
Yeah, I had heard about the no vacation policy, or take as much as you want, or, we'll drill down on that, because I think that's sort of the hook that gets everyone. It's like, wait, my team can take as many vacation days or weeks as they want. Are you kidding me? Like, aren't people going to go crazy? Is this going to be like spring break and they'll never come back? So we'll get to that. But you know what's fun? You mentioned psychological safety. So Amy Edmondson has been a guest on this podcast, and we talked for an hour and a bit all about psychological safety. And one of the fun things about doing this show is, pretty open-minded. Not all my guests agree with each other because, we are trying to create psychological safety, but we're going to talk about radical candor. We're going to talk about all these things that Netflix does. And so you were just shocked by that, right? By this idea that people could just say what they wanted. Say that principle again. I want to go there because adequate performance gets you a generous severance package.
That's right. I mean, that's, I think, the most provocative statement that's in the book. And I have to say that although I was taken aback by it, I loved something about it. And what I loved was the honesty. I'm so used to looking at these organizations who show me what their culture is about. I put it in quotes, about, right? And they're taught, we're all about integrity and respect. But of course, what they're saying is not what's actually happening in the organization. And here was a company who was actually not just speaking in, let's say kind of like fluffy overall positive words, but we're really daring to say, these are the dilemmas that our employees are facing on a daily basis. And you know what? When you come across a tough dilemma, like you can say, here we value security, or here we value talent density or high performance. Remember, here we value high performance even over security, right? So that was a company that was really daring to make a choice. And it's been one of my favorite learnings from this as I'm working with other organizations. Dare to make a choice, right? Look at the tough dilemmas and tell your workforce which way to move. Don't just soften around with the respect. No organization would say they value disrespect, right? So dare to go a little bit further.
So we're going to get into the cultural values. We'll spend the bulk of our time together on that today. But for people who are listening, I would encourage you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Erin, listen to the entire thing and the sequence. You say several times in the book with Reed, don't just, listen to the podcast, show up tomorrow and go, hey guys, there's no limits on vacation and you're going to have an amazing culture, because it doesn't work that way. Can you explain how these are either stacked or sequential or pieces of a puzzle that has to fit together to be able to work?
Yeah. And I think in order to start that, I actually have to tell a story.
Yeah, please do.
So the first time that I interviewed Reed, he told me about his first company. So Reed Hastings, right, the founder and CEO of Netflix, who I wrote this book with, his first company was an organization called Pure Software. And when he opened up PureSoft, at the beginning, it was just a small group of passionate people who were operating, let's say, kind of fast and loose. And what I mean by that was that they had no bureaucracy or procedures or rules that were telling them what they couldn't do, right? They were just using their best judgment to make decisions for the good of the company. But then the organization started to grow, right? It grew to a couple of dozen people and a couple hundred people, eventually a couple thousand people. And as it grew, some people did stupid stuff. And some people took advantage of the freedom that had been given to them. Like there was this story about this guy, Jim, and he used to fly every week from San Francisco to LA. And because there was no travel policy, he started flying first class. Right. And there was this woman named Charlotte, and she had this big dog. And because there were no rules telling her she couldn't, she started bringing the dog to work every day. Right. But one day that dog chewed a big hole in the conference room carpet. So Reed responded by doing what most chairmans or organizations do in these moments of chaos, which is that he put in rules and policies and procedures telling people what they couldn't do, right? But then something else happened as those control processes started to take root in the organization. And what happened was two things. First, that the most creative, mavericky employees, they started to leave the company because they wanted to work at a place that they could run free, right? And as Reed sometimes says, he realized that if you dummy-proof the system, only dummies want to work there. Right. And the other thing that happened was that the people who were really good at following the rules and processes were promoted into senior management positions. But these weren't the most flexible or innovative people in the company. And the company stopped innovating. And then when the environment shifted, the organization was unable to shift with the change in environment, and he had to sell the company. So his big learning from that was freedom, employee freedom breeds innovation, right? And process kills flexibility. And those were his two kind of like overriding ideas as he opened up Netflix. But I didn't answer your question.
No. It's a great question. And I want to drill down on that before we get to the original question. Some CEOs love process. A lot of entrepreneurs don't. And so we have been talking, we're a small company. We're like 8 people. And I was getting just some internal stuff. My team going, we really need an HR handbook here. And we're onboarding new people on a semi-regular basis. And like, it's really hard to onboard people. And I mean, we're not even talking 80 or 8,000. I mean, it's just 8, right? But you got to replicate yourself, particularly in a remote organization like we have. And my joke was, well, you can write an employee handbook as long as it's no more than 5 pages and has pictures. All right. So I don't want a whole bunch of rules. I just don't want a whole bunch of rules. And I had heard about your book. It came out. When did No Rules come out? Was that 2019?
September 2020. Yeah.
Oh, it was 2020. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'd heard about it, heard the buzz about the book. And then maybe in the early summer of 2021, I downloaded the audiobook, started listening to it, and I went, this is what has been in my heart, not nearly as brilliantly or well articulated, but this is the siren song of like what I want corporate culture to be like, because it's not about this sort of bohemian, do what you want when you want. You get like talent density and high performing teams and freedom and responsibility and autonomy and all of those things together. Is that something that Reed always craved? Because you mentioned he started with no rules and then it kind of went very bad. He became this bureaucracy, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs just dread. And he was very open in the book about just, how that one really didn't work out. So he had a chance to do it again with Netflix, right?
Yeah, well, I think that he is like many entrepreneurs and people who start organizations, which is both they love working in a place that is buzzing with creativity, but like the rest of us, he was under the spell of the industrial era. And I think, my biggest kind of overarching lesson from all of this was to just start to recognize how the vast majority of organizations today are still, obsessed with this focus on error prevention and replicability, which is an industrial era hangover. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the industrial era powered our economy for hundreds of years, right? So of course, we learned all of these methods for maximizing efficiency, reducing error as much as we could. And of course, we still do need those things to some degree. If you are running a manufacturing plant or you're working in a safety critical environment, by all means, follow the methods of the industrial era, right?
Yeah, if you're making pharmaceuticals, you probably want some error prevention, right?
That's right. Oh, we hope so, right?
Yeah.
But I think we all can see that in a growing number of teams and organizations today, the biggest risk is no longer making a mistake. The biggest risk is not being innovative enough, not being fresh thinking so that we become irrelevant, right? And that's why we really need to even fight off, I think, these tendencies that are in us, which is when someone makes a mistake, we put a process in place to make sure it doesn't happen again, right? And instead say, okay, one mistake happened, let's deal with that mistake, but not take away the freedom of the rest of the workforce at the same time.
Has the culture been key to scale for Netflix? Because they brought you in a time, they were an American company, and then they picked a couple of countries. I think Canada was early on the list, but then all of a sudden they went global. So they brought you in around that. Can you talk about how important culture has been to scale for them? And then with your culture mapping background, with all these global cultures, right? You got to then figure out, well, how do you be Netflix in Japan? How do you be Netflix in Indonesia, in Africa, in Europe, right? Yeah. Where the languages are different and the practices are different. So how does culture impact scalability?
Yeah, well, I think, of course, when you know all of your employees' names, it's still pretty easy to have a culture that's flexible and where your employees have freedom because you can kind of keep an eye on everything, right? But once you get to the level that you don't know all of your employees anymore, that's when our let's say human instinct kicks in for the leader to want to put in more controls, right? You feel uncomfortable. You don't want things to happen if you don't have your hands like controlling those things. But we really do, I believe, at that moment, if we want innovation, we need to think, okay, I have to just fight against the process, the goals, the drive for process that's in me, and think instead about ways to give my employees higher levels of freedom. And I think we should, Carey, talk a little bit later in the podcast about this strange culture at Netflix and what happened when they tried to take it into other countries, because that is also another story. But we probably need to look at the principles first.
Yeah, we'll look at the principles. And this is good because we do have, the majority of people who listen to this statistically would be people who run small organizations, but we also have some very, very large, like leaders who lead some very large causes, large companies, sports teams, and many who have international distribution as well. So I think this is going to be helpful. But basically, this is a sequence. So I'm just saying, don't pick and choose and say, oh, we're going to have no expense policy. Why is that a trap? Why is that a danger? Why does this need to go together?
Yeah, thank you. So that was the question you asked me so long ago that I didn't get to, but let me try to do it now. So when Reed opened up Netflix, he had this goal of creating this free work environment, an environment where people were not, run by management controls. But he also was concerned. He was concerned that at some point, if he didn't put in control mechanisms, that the organization was likely to descend into chaos, right? So he thought a lot about it, and he came up with what I'll call the Netflix experiment. And that experiment had three parts to it. So the first was, okay, in most organizations, most of the processes and rules that we put in place are there in order to deal with the less amazing employees, right? Kind of the medium ones, right? Our top performers, they don't really need to be controlled. Right? So what if I were going to try to create an organization that was made up only of top performers? And you brought up the word talent density earlier. I mean, of course, I know as your listeners hear this, they think, well, that's fine for Netflix. They have a lot of money, right? But at that time, that wasn't the case. So the choice that he made was to hire a lot less people, but to pay them more, right? And that's where you get the talent density, less employees, but better employees, right? And the thought was, if I have less employees, but better employees, then I can give them a lot more freedom. But I might still have some employees who really try to take advantage of the freedom that I'm giving them. Even if they're really high performing, they might not be honest, right?
Right.
So what if I then try to create an environment where all my employees are giving one another a lot of really candid, open feedback on an ongoing basis? And that way, when Jim tries to fly first class, Carey will say, hey, Jim, I don't think that's a good use of our money. Right? And we'll become accountable to one another. And then if we had that high talent density and we had that culture of candid feedback, then perhaps we could have an organization where we really had very low levels of rules and process controlling our employees' behavior. And that's where we'll get all of that innovation and flexibility going. And that's why we have to do it in that order, Carey. Because if we start talking about the freedom, but you don't have the top performers or the candor, well, things probably aren't going to go very well, right?
No, that's so helpful. And I would encourage people to get the book. It is a fantastic book. And the audiobook was great, but the way you lay it out, I've also got the hard copy of the book. The way you lay it out makes it really easy to follow along. There are charts and graphs. It's just beautifully laid out. So it's a thick book, but it's a fairly easy read that way. So I would encourage you, be careful when you try this at home. Do a little more homework, but you're going to get the overview in this interview. And it is fascinating because so much of it, as you've hinted, Erin, is counterintuitive. So let's start with talent density. Let's start with people. Talk about the culture of getting the very top talent, paying them well, adequate performance, gets you a generous severance package. Those principles that really did. I mean, I remember listening to the audiobook. I think I was washing my car when I heard about adequate performance gets you a generous severance package. And I stopped what I was doing and I'm like, holy crap. And there was a whole lot of other ideas in there, like even how low performers bring the entire team down. And how one, they use a lot of engineers, and engineers are expensive, but one excellent engineer is better than, 10 or 100 average engineers. Like there's so much in there. So let's start to unpack it just so that people can understand. Because I don't think there's a single person who leads an organization, leads a team, or started something that doesn't want high quality talent and want talent density. We all want it, but this is a very unique path to it. So can you start unpacking that?
Yeah, and I'll start with the least provocative.
Okay, great. We'll work our way up. All right. Okay.
So the least provocative is the part that you said a moment ago about what they call the rockstar principle. And if you have any software engineers who are listeners, perhaps they are familiar with this. I guess most software engineers know about it, but I didn't. So the rockstar principle is something that is known in the software business, and it's based on this research that was conducted where engineers were given a task and asked to complete it in a certain amount of time, and they all at least were adequate engineers, right? And what they showed in that research was that the top of those engineers performed at a 10 or more times better than another medium or adequate one. So what came out of that was just simply, therefore, if you are running an organization of engineers, you have a choice, right? Either you can hire 10 kind of adequate engineers, or you can hire one rock star, right? And you can pay that person as much as 10 times as what you would pay the others, right? So that's where that whole idea came from. That was known in the software industry. Reed's innovation was taking that and saying that should apply to any creative role, not to an operational role where we're scooping ice cream, right?
Yeah.
But any creative role where I'm working with someone, I'm trying to get them to come up with brilliant ideas or to imagine a better way of doing things, that the top performer can deliver at least at 10 times, maybe even 100 times more than an adequate one would. So that's the first one. And I think that one's not very provocative, but perhaps useful for us to think about as we're getting ready to hire people and thinking about how to use our money.
I think we all know that intuitively. There's someone we've worked with, someone we hired, or someone that's on our team now that we're like, wow, like if they left today, I'd be replacing them with 3 people, 5 people, or I don't even know. There's so much. They just produce, they get it done. They push me on ideas. Like they're just so great. And yet the math associated with it, I have a son who's an engineer, but I didn't know that principle, that's actually quantifiable. 10x or more is what a rock star performer will bring to the team over what an average or a good performer will bring to the team. Because you think it's double, right? But it's actually exponential.
That's right. And that's why it's actually so interesting that you said it that way, because that's why, then the question is, okay, well, should I hire 10 or should I hire 1, right? But if, of course, we're going for this kind of innovative environment, we want to hire that one rock star because we can offer more freedom, but also because of something that you said a few minutes ago, which is performance is contagious. Yes. And I think before I get into that, I'll just give kind of put your listeners in situation, right?
Okay, sure.
Okay, so like imagine that you are leading a team of 8 marketing managers. And when you opened up that team, when you started that team a year ago, you were really focused on developing a high performing team. So you used the rockstar principle to get the best, to hire less and pay them more. And then after you'd found who you thought would really be the best people, you invested a lot of time in coaching them and preparing them, giving them a lot of feedback. And now a year in, 7 of your 8 employees are amazing. Right. Okay. So these 7, they are exactly who you hoped they would turn into. They are rock stars. Right. Okay. So these people, you think every day, oh, thankfully, I have her on the team. Right.
Yeah.
And then there's Fritz.
Okay. Fritz is a nice person, right? Fritz is nice.
Fritz is a nice guy. You know what, Carey? Fritz is a nice guy. He's a sweet person and he works hard. Okay, so that's the thing about Fritz. But Fritz is not a high performer. Now, Fritz is not a low performer. I mean, he's not a horrible performer. If he would, you would have gotten rid of. If he was, you would have gotten rid of him. He's just kind of medium. And the thing is, you've given him a lot of feedback and a lot of coaching, and you really see now he's never going to turn into that high performer you thought he would be when you hired him. So the question for your audience is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about Fritz? Are you going to keep Fritz on the team? Or are you going to find, a way to move Fritz on to his next job?
Because there's nothing. Okay, I want to just pause for a moment, because we have a lot of not-for-profit and church leaders listening, as well as a lot of for-profit and business leaders listening. Just a little pet peeve here, Erin.
Yeah.
Church leaders are notorious for hiring out of charity. In other words, Fritz is a really nice person, can't find a job somewhere else. So we keep low performers on. And what you're saying is, no, Fritz is actually good at his job. Am I right to say there's nothing wrong with Fritz? He's just
not good at his job. He's just medium, Carey.
Yeah,
but yes,
he's okay.
He gets
he's
some
fine.
stuff done. He's okay. He's fine.
He's adequate. Which most people would say, well, then you have to keep him on, right? And Netflix says, no, you don't. So I just wanted to underscore that, and let's continue with Fritz, because this is so counterintuitive to so many listeners, and it is the problem in so many organizations.
Yeah. And so I've asked this question to lots of people, right? And I would say about, at least 60% say, I will keep Fritz on the team, and they'll say things like, well, if I have 7 high performing employees, that's enough, right? And of course, I want to show my employees that I'm loyal to them so that they will be loyal to me. Right. But actually what we've seen through a good deal of research is that if you let one performer on your team who's kind of like low or middle, that person will pull down the performance of the rest of the team. So there's this one piece of research that was conducted by a colleague of mine at another business school. William Phelps was his name. And William did this project where he invited 4 MBA students into a lab at a time. And he gave them a 45-minute task, and he rewarded them financially based on how well they performed. Now, unbeknownst to them, on 50% of the groups, on the teams, there was an interloper. And that interloper was an actor named Nick, right? And Nick had been hired to behave just like the other MBA students, but to do some things that were a little undesirable, right? Like sometimes he would act a little bit bored. He might put his feet up on the desk and like text his girlfriend, right? Sometimes he would act a little bit obnoxious. Like he might say things like, have you attended a business school class before? And what's so interesting is that William Phelps showed on team after team after team that those teams that had Nick on them performed at a 45% worse rate. And more interestingly than that was that the other people on the team started to take on his behaviors. So, for example, I've watched these videos, and there's one where he comes in, he's with the MBA students, and they think he's one of them, right? And they're really energized, right? They are ready to conquer this task. They want to get that reward money. They sit down, they're sitting up straight, ready to go. But Nick is playing a depressive pessimist. And, he's kind of low energy. He doesn't think it's going to work out. And it's just incredible because you can see on this video over about a 20-minute period that the 3 MBA students gradually become absolutely deflated, just like him. At one point, one of the women puts her head down on the table and says, oh my gosh, when is this going to be over? Right? And not only that, but when he acts a little bit jerky, they start acting jerky too, but not just to him, to one another. Yeah. So I think that most managers and leaders think an individual performance problem is an individual problem, right? Okay, that issue with Fritz, well, that's an issue between me, the boss, and Fritz. But we know from a lot of research that an individual performance problem is a systemic problem that impacts the entire team, sometimes even the entire organization. And we can see that really to get a really high performing team, we need to encourage our Fritzes to move on to other pastures so that then we can have performance still being contagious. But that meaning that performance is spiraling up as our employees are so delighted to be surrounded by stunning colleagues.
And average performers spiral you down, or they're like gravity. They just keep you glued below the level where you can perform. And when I thought about different teams over the years that I've led, I've seen that where average performers are on the team. It's almost like group work at school, if you remember that. You get a group of like, oh, I got the best students in my group. This can be a great project. Or sometimes you get into a group and there's that one deadbeat who just doesn't quite get it, or isn't going to do the homework or misses deadlines. And you're like, oh, and so that actually plays out in real life. So generous severance. So what you do is you tell the person, I don't think your time is here at Netflix or whatever your company is. And here's, whatever generous severance would be for that position months in advance, and you're done here. Like, is that how it works?
That's right. And I do think, I have to say that because Netflix is so public about this, people really opt in to the system. And I mentioned earlier that that high performance is in tension with security, right? So if you are trying to create a work culture that is people feel deeply secure, then that's not likely to lead to top performance. And I know that's quite provocative, right? Because we want to have both. Right? We want to have a work environment where everyone feels deeply secure and we have performance spiraling up. But at Netflix, what they've said is, okay, look, our goal here is to have an environment where people know that they will be surrounded by the best. And for those of you who want to be on a team where you are surrounded by the best, please come join us. And those of you who would prefer to work at a company that you may not be surrounded by the best, but you have a lot of job security, then this is probably not the best work environment for you. So people opt in, but there's a lot of positive energy with that excitement of working in those high-performing environments.
You mentioned security, and so I think you raised this in the book, and it's certainly been a critique of Netflix over the years that sometimes employees feel threatened because, am I going to get fired? Am I going to get fired? Like, is my performance adequate? How do you address that? Or do you just end up like where you're Jack Welch and the bottom 10% get fired every month? Like, where does that show up in Netflix? Like, how do I know I'm secure? How do I know I'm a rock star, not the guy who's, when you call me into your office next time, Erin, I'm gone.
Yeah, I'll answer that question in 3 parts. And let me say that what I'm going to suggest, it's crazy, but you could do it. Okay. All right. So it's crazy because it's so different than the way we normally do things. Let me say that I am 100% against the methods that were used at Microsoft and GE, which are sometimes stack ranking, sometimes called rank and yank, right? And those have been proven to be detrimental methods in organizations where
you fire your bottom performers every month or every year. Yeah.
That's right. Nothing worse for team spirit than to say, look, every year you have to fire 10%, because then it's going to be like, oh, Carey, I know either you're going to get fired or I'm going to get fired. So let me do everything to make sure it's you.
Yeah, exactly. And you raise that, right? Like, it can create competitiveness within the company where you're not competing against, Hulu, you're competing against each other.
That's right. So that's horrible. I think that's the last thing that we want to do. And I kind of like this image that they use at Netflix, which is to think about the organization as an Olympic team instead of as a family, right? So an Olympic team, of course, we try to hire the best. And then once we get the best, when we get the right person in every spot, we work hard on making sure that we are collaborative and we've got great team spirit and we're close to one another. I mean, teamwork is everything, right?
Yeah.
But we also know on an ongoing basis that if ever anybody is not the best person for that team, that we, the coach, owe it to the team that I then find the best person to replace them with, right? And that brings me to the other point. So at Netflix, they use something that's called the keeper test, which I know sounds super provocative, but whether your listeners like love it or hate it, I do actually think it's a very useful mechanism for leaders to at least evaluate what's going on around them. And this method is simply that if you are, let's say you are leading a team of 8 people, and you maybe every 6 months or so, you just do a little mental exercise. And you imagine that, for example, I don't know, Stanley on your team comes into your office and he says, Carey, boss, right? He says, I'm sorry, I found another job. I'm leaving the company. Right. And the question that you then ask yourself is, if Stanley told me that he were leaving my team, how would I feel? Right. I mean, would I be devastated? Yeah. Would I say, oh my gosh, Stanley, don't leave me? Right. What can I do to keep you on the team? Anything. And if you would fight to keep Stanley, then it's clear Stanley is the right person for that spot. Right? You don't need to check boxes or add up numbers. If you'd fight to keep Stanley, you know he's the right person, right? But would you perhaps feel relieved when Stanley told you that? Would you think, oh, good. Now, instead of focusing 80% of my energy on helping Stanley, I can put my energy where I want to, on helping my top performers be even better. Right. Or would you maybe even feel a little bit excited, like thinking about who you could get in that spot, right? Yeah. And that's where I think if your honest answer is, I think I would either feel relieved or excited if someone on my team told me they were leaving, then you really owe it to yourself and the team to ask yourself another question, which is, have I given Stanley the coaching and feedback he needs in order to be his best self, right? And if I have, okay, and I still see he's not turned into the performer I would fight to keep, then clearly, he's not the best person for that job, and I need to find another solution, right? And if I haven't given that feedback, boy, I better go do it right now, right?
Okay, so clarify this or correct me if I'm wrong. You wrote the book, I only read it. Okay, but I believe you even suggest that people can go into their boss and ask the keeper test. So if you're my boss, Erin, I can go in once a year or so and say, Erin, I'm not leaving, but if I told you I was leaving today, how hard would you fight to keep me?
Yeah, this is right? The crazy part, Carey. So that's why you said earlier, what do you do if you feel afraid? And I did see that actually often. I would have, some managers I found were really good at being candid with their employees on an ongoing basis. I would totally fight to keep you. And some employees said to me, well, I just didn't know, I thought I was a high performer, but would my boss fight to keep me? And this is where you can see that the responsibility is not just towards the manager, but also towards the employee. So if my boss hasn't told me and I'm feeling uncertain and that's making me feel uncomfortable, then I use the keeper test prompt. And that's just what you said, right? I put it, I should probably give you a little warning. So I'll set up a meeting and I put on the agenda, keeper test, right? So Carey, my boss, right? You know that that when I meet with you on Wednesday, that I'm going to ask you if you would fight to keep me, and you better be ready then to give me a really honest answer. And I know people feel often terrified when they think about asking the question, but I found that it was such an interesting again, mechanism, because once an employee gets the answer, then I learn, okay, my boss would fight to keep me. I have nothing to worry about. Or my boss wasn't sure, but now he told me clearly what I need to do in order to up my performance. So I have got clear feedback and I'm ready to act on it, hopefully to turn myself into the high performer that my manager is looking for.
Yeah, that is really, really good to think about. And I've mostly been a boss, but when I've had a boss, I was always asking that question in different forms. I always wanted to know how I was doing, and I would ask for feedback. Like, I want to know, am I hitting the target? Am I doing what's right? Okay, that's helpful. Let's move into another counterintuitive area, Erin. Let's talk about compensation, because that's another thing that I find generally, like, there's a lot of business leaders, entrepreneurs listening. Some of them pay very large salaries. Others are like in startup mode and they're bootstrapping, or they got a massive line of credit. A lot of people run charities, churches who listen to this podcast. So I find generally in the church, people are underpaid or overpaid, that there's almost no middle, and overpaid without merit. I'm not talking about, it's just like, oh yeah, we just write checks around here, that kind of thing. And there's no happy middle. What did you learn? Because it is a generous culture. If you're creative and you're part of that talent density, Reed even came out against paying performance bonuses and like percentages. So if the stock goes up, you get X. It's just like, no, you get a flat salary, no incentive bonusing. But a very generous salary that is bigger than the market will bear, or what is it, in the top 30% or 30% more than the average, or how does that work?
Well, it's just supposed to be top of market. So the idea is that you should imagine at any moment that the employees on your team are being headhunted by someone else, or in the church.
They will be. If they're that good, they'll be headhunted. Yeah.
Right. Right. And you should imagine that at any moment they're being offered a higher salary from someone else. Now, if you would fight to keep them, right, then you want to know what their top market rate is. And you want to pay them just a little bit above that. So they'll never come to you and say, I'm leaving the company because I got more somewhere else. And if they do, then that means that you didn't know what their market rate was ahead of time, right? So yeah, the idea is that you always kind of try to there's actually one like crazy thing they do at Netflix, another one, but they encourage their employees to speak to recruiters and even go on interviews at other companies in order to find out what their market rate is. So that and then come back and tell Netflix, right? So that Netflix knows that it's always paying that top of market rate. But I don't want to be too discouraging to those of you who are running nonprofit organizations, who are working in church environments. I mean, I do think that this isn't just about money. If you're in a kind of a heart work like that, if you're in a work environment where you find people who maybe you have employees who just want to make a big impact, right? Mm-hmm. But that still brings us back to the same principle, which is that if you're not paying your employees a lot of money, if you're a nonprofit and you don't have a lot and they could make a lot more money at a for-profit, don't you think that those top performers want to be surrounded by other top performers so they can see, wow, my organization is really making an impact? Right. And I think that's where you see that, of course, money is not the only thing, but high performers want to make a difference.
Yep. And at a certain level, I would just say, because I've lived in the church space for a long time, if you are underpaying your employees, you're making it really hard for them to stay employed or even to stay in the industry. And any tips, like Reed's running a for-profit company. He has a board of directors, but they're not micromanaging by any stretch. Any tips on how you would sell that to a board if you're running a not-for-profit? Like, hey, I went through that and I used the term living wage. I just said, guys, we have to start paying a living wage to our team. And so we did comparables. What does a teacher make? Teachers are well paid in Canada. What does a firefighter make? A school principal? We looked at some market indicators. And we don't pay crazy, but we pay well. And I don't want to make it so that, someone says, well, we have to be a 2-income house, or I've got to get a side hustle to be able to even make rent or pay the mortgage or buy groceries or put gas in my car. Any thoughts on that you could offer for leaders who have to make that case to a board?
Yeah, but I really want to go back to what I was saying earlier, which is that your board may feel, oh, well, we can't pay a lot because you've got so many people in your organization, right?
Right.
But what if you go back to your board and you say, you know what? I have 6 positions open, and I really believe that if I get one rock star in this position, that's just going to lift up this whole department. So let me put together all of that money and go out and hire the best. And if you do that in every area, you're not costing the company more money, right? You're just hiring less, you're getting more talent, and then that talent is spiraling up. So maybe that's not the kind of argument that you're looking for,
No,
but
that's actually a really good
argument to go to.
No, that's a really good argument because churches are notorious for keeping on poor talent to adequate talent. And many companies are. Many companies are too. Many businesses are as well. So I think that's brilliant. Okay. Let's talk about, why no bonuses? Why no bonuses? Why just a flat salary?
Yeah, so these are actually forms of control processes that we use in most companies.
Okay.
KPIs, right? Key performance indicators, management by objective, and pay per performance bonuses. Those are all control mechanisms that we use in order to kind of keep our hands firmly on our employees' shoulders and say, we'll only give you your money if you perform. Right. And there's those mechanisms were developed for the industrial era when things were changing less frequently. But what I've seen is that there is nothing worse than saying in January, these are your specific goals. And if you've met these goals in December, then you'll get a big payout, because that keeps us from being flexible as an organization. I mean, during the year, so many things change, and we want our leaders constantly focused on how do we need to adjust the organization direction to the right or the left based on the tensions of the moment, not focused on what do I need to do in order to get my bonus, right? So I do believe that idea of bonuses is totally outdated. Plus, since people don't know if they're going to get the money or not, it makes them less motivated than if you actually just give them the money right up front, assuming that they will perform well. And then if they don't, of course, adequate performance gets a generous severance, right? I mean, if they've shown poor judgment over time, well, then obviously that's not the right person for that spot.
Yeah. And if they fail to keep test, then you've got another issue. So I see how this is all pulling together. And then can you say something about just competition and bonuses, performance incentives, and that kind of thing? Because I thought that was perhaps in my mind, that was the most compelling argument against bonusing and performance incentives. So why does having performance incentives create competition among staff members?
Yeah. Oh, well, if, for example, you have a bonus pool, I mean, that's very common, right? So very common would be that I have a certain amount of money and I can give that to some or not, or to others. So either I can pool it together and give it to one employee, or I can give a certain amount to each employee. But again, these are processes that lead our employees to recognize that they are in competition with one another. On an Olympic team, we want our employees to all feel like, you know what, our goal is that each of us will be performing, at maximum potential. And my goal is to make sure that I do everything I can to help you perform and help her perform. And that will also increase my own performance. So you don't want to divide up your bonus pool or have anyone feel that they're being compensated based on how well one person does in comparison to another.
Right. Okay, super helpful. Let's talk about candor as well. This is a challenge in so many organizations because there's what you said to your boss, there's what you say at the dinner table when you're debriefing at home. What I really wanted to say was, or what I really think of him is, and people have a hard time telling the truth at work, don't they?
Oh, we do have a hard time telling the truth. I think it's important because so many companies these days, organizations today are talking about the importance of feedback. And I do believe that there's been a growing awareness that giving a lot of candid feedback to one another is really a free way to boost the performance and success in your organization. But the problem, Carey, is the amygdala.
Okay.
So
Tell us about that.
what I mean by that is that, okay, well, of course, we have different parts of our brain, right? And one part of your brain is the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex is the most logical part of your brain. The frontal cortex loves feedback, right? The more direct, the better, says the frontal cortex, right? So the frontal cortex understands the benefit of feedback. It recognizes that in a high-performing organization, we all will benefit if we tell one another honestly what we think that each of our colleagues could do a better job. And especially our frontal cortex recognizes I should give my boss clear and direct feedback to help him or her perform better, right? And if I'm the leader, my frontal cortex says, please, employees, give me direct feedback so I can perform better. That's great. The reason that this never happens in organizations, or so rarely happens, is the amygdala. And the amygdala is the most primitive part of your brain, the most reptilian part. The amygdala is very concerned with finding safety in numbers. So, of course, historically, if you got kicked out of the tribe, that would lead to death, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
So, Carey, if you come to me and you say to me, Erin, when we were in that meeting yesterday, I really felt you spoke with such intensity and that it just squashed out all of the other ideas in the room. And I think you'd be more successful in the next meeting if blah, 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 right? If you give me that feedback, my amygdala is likely to start setting off an alarm, right? And that alarm is saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to get kicked off of this team, right? And that, of course, physically throws your body into fight or flight, right? So fight, you deny it, right? I become defensive. It's not true. You're the problem. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, welcome to every marriage and every, yeah.
Okay, the old amygdala. Right? The other problem, or flight, right? Flight is that I say, oh, thank you so much. Thank you for telling me that. But then I try to never speak to you again, right?
I'm just going to go into the corner and cry for an hour. Okay, leave me alone.
If I'm your boss, you give me that feedback and I say, if I'm your boss and you give me that feedback, I say, well, thank you very much. But then I kind of put a black check next to your name. Oh, well, this person is not loyal to me as a leader.
No promotion.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So what we need to do in organizations in order to take advantage of what the frontal cortex knows, but the amygdala is afraid of, what we need to do is put structured feedback moments into our collaboration on an ongoing basis. Right.
This is not an annual 360. This is like a daily thing.
Well, let's say at least monthly, right? I mean, or weekly. So for example, Carey, like let's say you and I are colleagues and every week we meet with a supplier or a client, right? Well, maybe we decide that twice a month, we're going to meet, or at least once a month, we're going to meet just to give one another feedback, right? Mm-hmm. And in that meeting, I know that you're going to tell me what you think. You're not there to tell me what you love about me. In that meeting, you're going to tell me what I can do in order to do a better job in my next meeting. And I'm going to tell you what I think you could do to do a better job. And now we know, okay, that meeting's going to happen and I expect to receive clear feedback. And I'm just going to tell my amygdala, this isn't something to freak out about. Right. And they do something that I did think was crazy at Netflix when I first heard about it. They do these 360-degree feedback dinners.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that. Talk about the dinners.
Yeah, so because strange.
There's a story in the book, I think, toward the end that's just insane. Like,
well, what they do is they go out maybe once a year or so, right? I mean, it's not a process. It's not mandatory, but most managers do it. About once a year, they would go out with their team over a meal usually, but lately they do it over Zoom, right? And they take turns. So I'm up first, right? We're all around the table. I'm up first and we go around and each person at the table gives me some feedback about what what Susan thinks that I could do in order to improve my performance, right? I say, thank you very much. And then we move on to David, right? And each person gives me feedback. Now, when I first heard about that, I just thought, well, what's the point, right? Why do you have to drag my weaknesses through the group?
In front of everybody. Like, give it to me one-on-one in my office, okay?
Right. Can't you tell me that in private?
Yeah.
But I saw it created such an interesting opportunity, because when people give feedback one-on-one, well, first of all, my amygdala is likely to feel something like, wait, maybe this is about you, not about me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, I never really know whether or not you're right or not. Right. Maybe you give me feedback and I think, well, okay, but do other people think that? Right. But when we go into a group setting like that, I may hear, oh, well, Suzanne thinks that I'm too intense, but everybody else in the team disagreed with that and said my energy level was my greatest asset. Whereas there was something else that everyone on the team said I need to work on. So now I really know where my focus is. And
getting like a group consensus.
Yeah. And what I heard from people like time and again was it's kind of hard to go into the meeting, right? You feel a little bit uncomfortable going in, but once you get started, you see it'll be fine because everyone is there to be kind and generous and no one wants to hurt you or attack you. And everyone gets a lot of tough advice. And often I heard people say, you know what, Erin, that was the greatest developmental moment of my life, right?
Wow.
So I actually started doing those on my own team, Carey, despite my initial skepticism. And even for your listeners who think it's absolutely wild, don't underestimate it, especially if you have high talent density. If you have a lot of Fritzes and Nicks on your team, you might not be ready yet.
Okay. What difference has it made on your team, Erin?
Well, what I saw was that instead of it being like always me, the manager, who had to tell each person what to do, and then it was like creating issues between me and that person, that this became something where we were all accountable to one another, right? And sometimes the group would start joking about it or pointing it out in a lovable, joking way, right? And since we all had things we were working on, it just became like, okay, this is our improvement project. Right? As opposed to, well, that guy said something to me and I don't think that was very nice. Right.
Right. Well, and this really, I've seen leaders use power where they basically put a little feedback society together, either on their board or in their top leaders, and it's all their fan club. And even though they have challenges, and that really impacts scale, that really impacts talent density, all of those things. So if you're really serious about your mission, take notes. Okay, so you got radical candor. I want to go back to the two most famous and contentious issues. Let's talk about no vacation policy or take what you want. So what is the official Netflix policy on vacations?
Yeah, so it's 2 words, take some. So there's
fantastic.
So that's it.
It fits on my 5 pages. It's good.
Yeah. The vacation policy is there is no vacation policy. And of course, I had the same concerns when I heard this that your listeners did. One of 2 concerns, right? The first concern is you think, the first one everyone thinks, oh my gosh, that's horrible. Right? Oh, that's horrible because no one will take any vacation at all. Right. So that's the first one that people worry about. And the second one that people think is, oh my gosh, that's horrible for my organization because people will go on vacation all the time. Right.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm going to be in Europe in the summer and South America in the fall. And I think I'll hit Australia in the spring. And please keep the paychecks coming, right?
That's right. That's the entrepreneur's worry, right? When the worry that if I don't control my employees, that they'll start behaving irresponsibly.
Right.
But that really brings us to this idea of what I think is one of the most interesting sayings that we can take from this, which is lead with context, not
Okay.
controls. And what I mean by that is that if your employees, if you have a group of high performing employees that have good judgment and are really committed to the success of the team and the organization, then they don't need rules telling them what they can and can't do. And in fact, if you give them rules, it's likely to make them behave less responsibly. Like almost feel like, okay, you treat me like a child, I'll act like a child. Right.
Right.
But instead, we can engage in thoughtful conversation on an ongoing basis with each employee about the needs of the organization and the desires of that employee in order to give employees freedom, but also help them understand, what's kind of the realm of okay around here. Right. And I found all sorts of things. I found some employees who worked like a 90-hour week and then took every 3 weeks off. Right. I found other employees who worked, like in the morning and after midnight, but never in the afternoon.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the beauties of having these kind of free work environments is that, of course, every employee has, different passions and a different personality and different things they want to accomplish. And in an organization with a lot of rules, those rules really squash out the individual's needs. Right. So here we can have adult discussions and get to the same point where people are taking a reasonable and healthy amount of vacation, but also we don't have these kind of one rule fits all sort of thing that we have in most organizations.
Reed did something when he implemented this. I don't think it was right away. It was maybe after a year or two where he decided he needed to draw a line in the sand about what the expectation was. And he ended up taking 6 weeks off, was it? Can you explain the thinking behind his decision?
Yeah. So if you are going to have a low rule or a low control work environment, then you need two things, right? You can't just remove the controls and hope that everything will go okay. Even if you have high talent density and you have candor, you still need lead with context, not control, which is what we just spoke about and we'll talk more about later. But you also need, of course, great modeling from leadership. I mean, how I behave as a leader becomes so important. And if I tell you, oh, please take a good amount of vacation because I really believe it's important for your health, but then I never take any vacation myself, I mean, you're not going to take vacation, right? It doesn't take you long to figure out I don't mean it. Right. So instead, modeling becomes everything. And Reed does take, consistently 6 weeks of vacation every year, which is, of course, a lot for an American CEO. I think more interestingly than that, he's always talking about his vacations. It seems like every time I saw him during this research project, he would be on stage talking to his team and he'd start out by showing slides from his last vacation, right? And of course, he does that for a reason. He does that to say, look, to be successful in this company, you're expected to take vacation also, right? Trickle down.
I was so surprised, again, working through the book and then we're trying to implement the principles. We didn't have a vacation policy. We pay for people's vacation, et cetera, not for their vacation, but just you're paid when you're not working kind of thing, whether you're sick or whatever. And I just said, I brought it to the team and I said, look, you need to take some time off. And they're like, well, we got lots of podcasts that have to ship and we have this. And they're all like telling me why they can't take time off. And I'm like, guys, I am taking July off, like the entire month. I'm like, no, July. Okay. I'm going to start with 4 weeks. I'm gone. You run the company and your homework after further discussion, I'm summarizing a half hour in 1 minute. I said, okay, guys, you're struggling with this. Here's you see, we gotta do this and we gotta do the daily email. Okay, your assignment is you have to give me all of your vacation days for 2021 next week, and we're putting them on the company calendar, and you have to take them. It was so counterintuitive because you're afraid everyone's going to go to Hawaii and never come off the hammock, right? And in the meantime, they're just concerned because you have high talent density. You have people who really want to make a difference.
That's
right. And so what happens if you have an abuser? What happens if you have somebody who does go to Hawaii for 3 months? Like, does radical candor take care of that?
Well, I actually don't. I actually think if you have a system of high performance in your organization, that people are, and freedom, that people are so passionate about what it is, about what they're doing, that unless, okay, maybe if I've just like accomplished something really important, right? Like, I just had this huge project and I just poured my soul into it and it was a great success. And now I'm going to take 2 months off.
Yeah.
Great. Do it. Right. But I don't think that you're at much risk of that, of people just disengaging when they have the freedom to choose their own projects and work on things that are really important to them. Right. And that's what we'll talk about in a moment. I think a much bigger risk, as you said, is people not taking vacation. And that's why, like your action, Carey, it's so important, because when you take a month off like that, all of July, and you say, this is what leaders do in our organization, then people think, oh, really? I could do that? Right? Mm-hmm. And maybe they don't dare a whole month at once, but maybe they'll dare 3 weeks. Right?
They're going to work their way up to it, and they're going to build teams, and they're going to take responsibility, and they're going to lead. Yeah. And it's exciting. And if you're worried about, well, what if everyone takes time off at once, just read the book, because I want to move on to other things. You deal with that in the book.
That's right.
You can see it's so memorable because I read it once and yet I remember all of these things. So well written. Let's talk about travel approval and expense approvals. So, and decision making, that was radical in the book. Like, I remember when Netflix expanded internationally, there was the whole decision about like a multi-million-dollar decision about a documentary. Yeah. And man, the push down level of decision making is astonishing. So let's start with expense and travel. There's no expense policy. Is that right? Same thing with vacation?
So it's just the same thing as the vacation, which is that spend money in Netflix's best interest. Spend money in your organization's best interest. And I think we can really see here the weight of responsibility that employees feel when they see that their organization and their boss trusts them enough to sign off on a big purchase or on a new deal without needing to get approval from someone above them, right? So that's really this kind of, dear employees, we trust you to behave like adults, and therefore they behave like adults, right? But I think what's so critical, Carey, that you said a moment ago is that those policies, like the vacation policy or the expense policy, I think those are really just symbols of freedom, right? Those are not, Netflix has not been a massive success because of their vacation policy.
Right. It's not like, well, we got rid of vacation rules and all of a sudden we're all over the planet. That's not right. It.
Yeah. That's right. Those are symbols of something that's happening at a much deeper level in the organization. Right. And that's where, where you brought up this whole thing about decision making, which is that the boss's job is not to approve or disapprove a decision. But that's something that's pushed down, all the way down to what they call the informed captain, which is someone who may be many, many levels below in the organization.
Yeah. On that note, again, after I read the book, we had a six-figure contract, might have been a multi-six-figure contract, which in our case is still a very big contract in our company. And I thought about it. Okay, put your money where your mouth is, because in the past I would have read it. I would have signed off on it. It was a 24-year-old who was responsible. I said, you decide. Yeah. And if you think it's a good deal, you sign the contract. Pretty sure he read every clause and signed the contract.
And you know what? I bet he was working harder the next day.
Oh, yeah.
Really,
exactly.
that really instigates these feelings of ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Employees start to feel so invested when they see, well, gosh, it's my judgment that will impact the company. They use this great image. It's my favorite image. I've been talking about it all the time, this decision-making image. And I think in the vast majority of teams and organizations today, we still find a decision-making pyramid. And what I mean by that is that the leader or the chairman is at the top of the pyramid and the lower level employees are at the bottom. And of course, a lower level employee can make an inexpensive or or unimportant decision. But for anything expensive or important, it has to be pushed up the pyramid for approval.
Yeah.
But if we think, okay, lead with context, not control, and something even more radical, don't seek to please your boss, seek to do what's best for the organization. If we have those things in mind, then we could move to an image of a decision-making tree. And with the decision-making tree, we have the leader or the chairman who's down there in the dirt, right? Who's at the, sorry to put you at the dirt, Carey. Who's down there like at the root of the tree. You feel fine down there?
Right.
And that leader is setting the direction for the company, right? Okay, this is our North Star. These are the key dilemmas and tensions that we need to keep in mind and remembering which ways to turn when we come across them. These are all the things we have to keep in mind when we make decisions in the organization. And then we have like the next level of leaders, maybe the executive leadership team, and they're there at those big lower trunks, setting more direction for their teams and departments. But then you have the lower level managers who are there up there at the tiny branches, up at the end leaves of the tree. And those are the ones like that 24-year-old person on your staff. Those are the people who are signing off on those big decisions, or I mean, at least on some of the big decisions that keeping in mind all of the context that's been set for them, for the organization. And that's where we really find that we can empower our employees beyond what we had ever imagined. And what I love about this is that, like, if you're leading an organization that you hope will grow, I mean, if you think about a pyramid, it can only grow so fast, right? There's a pretty clear bottleneck right there at the top. And the bottleneck is the leader, right? But with a tree, we can see what's happened at Netflix, which is that your growth possibilities are endless, depending on the context that's being set by the trunk, right? And you can grow as fast or as wildly or as in many directions as that tree may choose, because there's no bottleneck.
Well, it's really interesting because if you think about like even a church, you can think about that in terms of staff. And it's like, well, we only have 5 staff, which would be big for a lot of churches. But if you actually think about the people who attend your church and the members, then you're into hundreds or thousands of people, or in some cases, tens of thousands. And if you think of them as engaged and you start to percolate this through your whole culture, you will get a rapidly growing organization as opposed to bottlenecking decisions. Same, we've seen this with online movements and online companies. If your customers become raving fans, they almost become the enthusiasts and the decision makers for you. So I think that is so worth exploring. The other fringe benefit for I talk to overwhelmed, overburdened leaders every single day. Yeah. You were shocked when you met with Reed Hasting's because, I think you know where I'm going. Do you want to tell us when you met with Reed and say, how are we going to write this book? You're the CEO of Netflix. How are you going to have time to actually write a book? What did he tell you? What was that meeting like?
I remember that meeting so well. I didn't know him that well at the time. And when we agreed to meet, so I live in Paris, we'd met at a very early morning. We were in a coffee shop in Paris. I remember that the coffee shop hadn't really opened yet. The chairs were still up on the table. And this was really concerning me. I just didn't understand how we could run this company and write a book at the same time. So I said, Reed, how much time are you going to be able to devote to this? And he said, I can give you as much time as you need, Erin. I'm not very busy right now. And I remember I was like, what? You're not busy right now? But I came to see later that actually that's his fundamental goal, is to not be the chief decision-making officer, right?
Wow.
And of course, if you are the top of the pyramid, then you are always too busy to invest in something like, some kind of passion project or whatever it may be. But Reed told another story to me about how Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook came one day in order to, I guess they swap. Sometimes these leaders like go and observe one another, right? And she shadowed him for a day and went to all of his meetings. And she said afterwards, wow, that was really weird, Reed. I was with you all day long and you didn't make one decision. And he said he just felt great. He just felt great because that was his absolute goal, was to make as little decisions as possible, right? And the fewer decisions he made, the more that he was really living by this idea of putting the CEO down there in the dirt, right?
So I have to ask the question, what does he do all day?
Well, so how he spends his time, it's actually quite remarkable. He does huge numbers of one-on-ones with people throughout the organization. So he spends, hours and hours having 30-minute meetings with people at various levels in the company. And he's there not in order to tell them what they can or cannot do, but in order to both hear what they're thinking so he knows how to adjust, how he's setting the context for the company, right? And also so that he can give them context as he hears them maybe misunderstanding some of the key principles. So he's in this constant contact, and then they have these quarterly meetings where they bring together all of their leaders, and that's the time to focus on making sure that the context is set as effectively as possible.
And was he accessible when you were writing the book? I mean, I imagine it was a year-long process or longer to write this book.
Well, I wouldn't say that he had nothing else to do, but every Sunday morning we spoke.
Wow. And he wrote half the book. You wrote half the book, the whole deal. Like, it's pretty cool. He
was half involved. I wouldn't say he did half of the writing, but we talked every Sunday, and every Sunday we worked on it together.
Great. That's amazing, because so many leaders are there like, I just don't have the time. I don't have the time. And now you can begin to see, when you really empower your team, you give them that culture of freedom, responsibility, autonomy. That's when great things happen. Okay. So anything we haven't covered, you wanted to talk, I know you wanted to talk about Netflix expanding globally, because they went from this American company that worked in America, kind of, took over from Blockbuster, the whole deal, and just took us all into the digital age and led the way. And now they're global. So go where you wanted to go with that.
Yeah, well, that was because my first book, The Culture Map, is all about national cultural differences. When I first started working with Netflix, that was my big concern. They were getting ready for this big international expansion. And I just was particularly concerned at the time about what was going to happen with this idea of candid feedback around the world. And I do remember one story from one of the American managers who had moved to Japan, and she was trying to get her employees to give her candid feedback. And in one of her one-on-ones, she said to one of her Japanese employees, please give me feedback. What can I do in order to be a better manager to you? And the woman started crying. And she said, Josephine, I really want to be Netflix, but I just need to be clear. I've never given anybody candid or open feedback before, let alone my boss, right? And what I saw was quite interesting, which is that many of the behaviors that we're working in California, like anytime feedback, meaning I can give you feedback at anywhere, anytime, didn't work so well in places like Brazil or Singapore or Tokyo. But when they said, for example, in Sao Paulo, dear Brazilian team, right, please work together to figure out what methods you'll be using here in Brazil in order to make Candor come alive in a way that works in your culture. Then each country was able to come up with their own methods for making sure that Candor and that feedback was getting out there, but in a way that was culturally appropriate, right? So I think that that's the message that we can take away from this, is that if we are a global organization, we can keep the same principles around the world, but we can't assume that the techniques we use locally will work in other countries. Those things we need to allow, to encourage to grow and to grow around the world in each country.
So have they been able to keep the principles? Like you would say in Japan or Singapore, there is radical candor. There is that kind of openness. It just happened in a slightly different way than it would have in the US.
What was fascinating in Japan, the most surprising thing happened. I never would have thought that, which is that they really responded well to the 360 feedback dinners. So spontaneous feedback, it really was not working culturally for them. But perhaps because it's quite a group-oriented society, and because they had a clear kind of instructions for how the feedback was going to be given to be helpful to one another, and they all knew what the expectations were and how they should prepare. I actually found the Japanese to be better at it than the Americans were. So they started doing those 360 dinners, every quarter instead of every year. And that way they were getting the feedback out there, even though it wasn't maybe happening like spontaneously in the hallway. So yeah, they found their ways.
Wow, that's so great to know. I got to ask you, well, I got you because you're the culture mapper. What are the differences with Canada? Got to ask as a Canadian.
Oh, well, in terms of candor, so I have a feedback scale, right? It looks at when I have to give someone negative or critical feedback, how direct we are with that feedback, right? And what I see on that is that countries like the Netherlands and Israel are two of the most direct cultures in the world, right? Okay, so the amygdala is not very likely to go off with a little bit of feedback over there. You can
have a Dutch background, so yeah, we are good at blunt.
That's right. And then the U.S. is towards the middle of the scale. So although on the one hand, we are focused on, let's say, verbalizing feedback in the U.S., we also do a lot of positive wrapping. So when we give feedback, this whole 3 positives with every negative and catching people doing things right, which is not so common in most European countries where in Europe, we may be a little bit more blunt than in the US. And then if we move over to Latin America, a little bit less direct than the US. And then you go over to countries like Japan or Thailand, even less direct. Canada is a little bit less direct than the US. So also towards the middle, but a little bit less direct than the US. And of course, in the US, we have strong regional differences. So as you know, the New Yorkers are much more direct. You Canadians, a little bit more like us Minnesotans, right?
Right. And we can be passive aggressive sometimes too. Oh, that was great. It was terrible. We can do that sometimes as Canadians. Any final words, Erin? This has been so helpful.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that I think often when people hear this, they think, well, that works for Netflix, but there's no way that we could do this here. I mean, we already have a culture. It just seems like too much. And I just want to encourage you, all of your listeners, if you want more innovation, if you want more flexibility, if you want your employees to feel more autonomy and more responsibility and to get that those benefits that come from freedom and responsibility, then you don't have to do this all at once. And it didn't happen like that at Netflix. It's not like they woke up one day and boom. Instead, you can take it just small step by small step. Like maybe you can do one thing in your organization to increase talent density. Maybe you're not ready to fire Fritz, but maybe you are ready to hire one person instead of 4 in order to get somebody who's better, right? Who's a higher performer. Whatever thing you're ready to do, one step to increase talent density, then one step to increase candor. Maybe you think that those 360 feedback dinners are not for your team, but maybe you are ready to start putting, a feedback meeting on the agenda every month, or any other way to get a little bit more candor out there. Take that one step, whatever door opens for you, and then after you've taken one step towards one step towards talent density, and one step towards candor, now one step towards freedom. Maybe the vacation policy you're not ready to let go of, but maybe just like you said a moment ago, Carey, maybe you have one employee and you're really going to let them make a decision instead of making them come through you for sign off. And then little by little, month after month, year after year, we can work towards a culture where we empower our employees more, and then we reap the benefits with innovation, speed, and flexibility.
Well, the book is called No Rules Rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention. It's by Reed Hasting, the founder and CEO of Netflix, and Erin Meyer. Erin, it's been great to be with you today. If people want to know more about you, they can find the book obviously everywhere, but tell us where people can connect with you online because you're a fascinating follow.
Thank you, Carey. Such a pleasure to be with you. My website is erinmeyer.com, and please join me on LinkedIn. I'd be very happy to be in touch with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.